Welcome to lecture number 5. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about commodity art and specifically Damien Hirst. So Damien Hirst, as you can see, was born in 1965. There's a picture of him uh, looking as he does. He grew up in a working class family, and he described himself as being a wild child. When he was young, he was arrested for shoplifting. He got really into punk rock music, and he thought that was kind of a cool style. And was basically a hellion when he was a teenager. Um, his parents tried to control him. He mentioned about how he had this record of a 45, which is like a small record of one of the Sex Pistols songs, and his parents tried to melt one of them. And he actually wasn't that mad about it. He thought it was kind of interesting what happened when the vinyl record melted. So he got a little bit of himself together. He tried to apply to the Leeds College of Art and Design, which is a very fancy school. At first, he was denied admission, but he got some advice from people and was accepted the next year. And then he went to an even fancier school, Goldsmiths at the University of London. And one of his first exhibitions was the Frieze exhibition in July 1988. He was part of a group of these artists, including Chris O'Feely, who I'll talk about later in the class, called the Young British Artists. And their idea was this: if you're going to a graduate school, if it's a fancy one and not so fancy one, then you'll be in this kind of situation where you have to get through school, then you finally do a student exhibition. And when you do, then you're supposed to smooze a bunch of rich people and hope that they buy some of your art. And then you get out of school, you do a group exhibition with a bunch of people, smooth some more rich people, and then hopefully sell some art to them. And some of these artists wanted to kind of get out of that type of work, because whenever you're trying to um, make things for an audience of wealthy people, it can limit the types of art that you can make. It can limit the subjects. It can limit the type of experimentation that you might want to do as well. So some of these artists had the idea that they would make their own types of art exhibitions so that they could make their own types of art. Some of these artists were part of the early kind of electronic music scene, which they would call house music or hardcore house music at this time. And many of those types of people in that scene and the people that were DJs and that were making music, they had an idea on how they could kind of promote their art, because a lot of the clubs where DJs would normally play didn't want the kind of music they were playing. They associated it with like drug use and underage kids, and they just didn't want to deal with that sort of thing. So a lot of the people in that scene, they would say find an abandoned warehouse, and they would move in some sound systems. They would have different rooms. They would have a big giant room, which would usually play house music. And then it would have smaller rooms that would play other kinds of music that wasn't quite as popular. And then they would usually have a chill room. And with this, they would either charge a really small amount of money or nothing at all. Even if they did charge money, it would be hard to collect sometimes. And that way they could kind of practice their art and get a crowd. And that worked really well. So the young British artists tried to do the same thing. When they were in school, they got some of the same types of warehouses that people were throwing parties in, which are called raves nowadays, but back then everyone called them parties. And they would do the same thing. They would have an artist, and artists would get a room. They would put up their paintings or their sculptures or what, or their experiences, whatever they were, like light shows, and they would do that. And that way they could kind of speak to people that were other artists and who were interested in the art, not as, an investment property, but because they really wanted to experience something new. So somewhat ironically, one of the most famous gallery owners, certainly the wealthiest in the UK, Charles Saatchi, ended up showing up to some of these shows and buying some of their art, and it allowed some of these artists to get started and make the kind of art that they wanted to make. So this is one of his earliest pieces. It's called 1,000 Years. You can see it's from 1990. And this art is kind of strange. You can see it's made out of steel, glass, flies, and maggots. That's for real. And in a sectocutor, meaning one of those electronic things that kills insects. And what he thought was interesting about this type of art is he wanted, when people went to see art, they would see things and have experiences that they weren't expecting, that they would never expect. So he thought about how artists a lot of times would confront very disturbing subjects, death and eternity, but he wanted to do it in a very visceral way. So that was his idea with this. Hirst made the way viewers encounter objects in a museum as much the subject of his work as the objects themselves. So in other words, the shock of kind of coming upon this, actual bugs being killed, maggots being born out of the cow's head, and then that cycle continuing. It was shown, this particular piece, at the Sensation exhibition, which Saatchi had put on at the Royal Academy of London in 1997, along with Chris O'Feely's Madonna, which is a piece we'll talk about later on. So Hirst said that he was influenced by some artists such as Francis Bacon, the 20th century Francis Bacon, not the 16th century one, and Michael Craig Martin. So this is an example of the type of art that Francis Bacon was doing. You can see figure with meat. And again, Francis Bacon was really interested in covering like kind of darker subjects. And what Damien Hirst was doing is taking that and just making it more real in a real literal way, because there's actual meat in Damien Hirst's piece. Then the other piece, and he thought this was really interesting, was this Michael Craig Martin piece called An Oak Tree from 1973. And he said when he approached this, he said this was like the most interesting artwork he had ever seen before in his life. So what the oak tree is you're looking at it. It's a shelf, and on the shelf is a glass of water. So Craig Martin did an interview talking about this piece, which is called Oak Tree. So to begin with, could you describe this work? Yes, of course. What I've done is change a glass of water into a full-grown oak tree without altering the accidents of the glass of water. The accidents? Yes, the color, feel, weight, size. Do you mean that the glass of water is a symbol of an oak tree? No, it's not a symbol. I've changed the physical substance of the glass of water into that of an oak tree. It looks like a glass of water. Of course it does. I didn't change its appearance, but it's not a glass of water. It's an oak tree. Can you prove what you claim to have done? Well, yes and no. I claim to have maintained the physical form of the glass of water, and as you can see, I have. However, as one normally looks for evidence of physical change in terms of altered form, no such proof exists. Haven't you simply called the glass of water an oak tree? Absolutely not. It's not a glass of water anymore. I've changed its actual substance. It would no longer be accurate to call it a glass of water. One could call it anything one wish, but that would not alter the fact that it is an oak tree. Isn't just this a case of the emperor's new clothes? No. With the emperor's new clothes, people claim to see something which wasn't there because they felt it should. I'd be very surprised if anyone told me they saw an oak tree. So this just goes on and on. And he's talking about, you can kind of define it for yourself, because in some ways, I think it's hard to know exactly what he's trying to do with this piece. But Hirst was really struck by all of this, including this interview, which functioned as a sign for this particular piece. So he saw that as kind of an inspiration for what you could do. This is one of his most famous pieces. It's called The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And like a lot of people around his age, he had seen the movie Jaws in the 1970s, and it was about a shark. And some of the main themes of that movie aren't just, if you go to a beach, you can get attacked by a shark. It's more like these faceless kind of death machines are out there. And there's a fear of that kind of idea. And it's not just of sharks, but of other things that can cause death. So he wanted to make this piece. And the way he sets it up, with the first time he showed it is you basically come up the stairs into the gallery and you're presented with this real shark. And he wanted to talk about how this is the reminders of the fleetingness of life. So this piece is somewhat controversial, partially because he made a copy of it, and the original one was really badly taxidermied, so it started to look really bad after a while. So he made a copy of it for this rich collector who paid millions of dollars for it. But also, there had been other artists who had thought of similar ideas as this, and some of those artists had felt like Hirst had stolen from them, and this is something that's going to happen again. So he continued with these types of animal type of pieces inside of these vitrines. This is mother and child divided, and this is very literal. So it took a saw, it might have been a laser saw actually, and cut the calf and the cow in half, and then shows them in different pieces. And kind of like referencing the earlier artwork with the glass of water and oak tree, he talks about how he has a belief in art's ability to show ideas as physical things. And in a way, that's a literal definition of what art is. So you can see here, again, this is somewhat disturbing the way it is. But again, talking about life and death, the big kind of subjects. Again, somewhat gruesome, not exactly the best taxidermy being done here. And this one away from the flock, similarly done. So this piece, Let's Eat Outdoors Today, is kind of extending the piece that we looked at earlier, 1,000 Years. He said, I just wanted to find out where the boundaries were, he says. I found out there aren't any. I wanted to be stopped and no one will stop me. So he kept making these pieces over and over again. And this one is basically extending the earlier one where you have the food on the table, and then that creates maggots, and then you have the bugs come out and the bugs get killed by the electrocution device. You can kind of see how he's starting to look at his art like he's almost out of his control at this point. So he kept making other pieces that were a little bit more conventional. And this was another one where he was criticized for perhaps stealing from other artists. A lot of people had done this sort of thing before, but Damien Hirst definitely didn't create it, and other people had created it to use almost as art therapy, where you have a spinning disc and then you kind of throw paint at it and you can get these cool effects. So he was criticized for that not being particularly original. Made these pieces, which if you had gone to school in the UK or in some former pieces of the UK Empire, if you lived in a country that used to be part of the British Empire, you'd be familiar with this piece because they'd be used in science classes and junior high, elementary school, high school. And what he did is he kind of like the pop artist we saw before, he took this thing that most people would experience in the UK and made it huge and massive. So this is the way to teach anatomy. Basically, you can take all these different parts out. You can see how the human body works. He makes it huge. He calls this version of it him. So it was the Young Scientist kit. And again, this was just, even though you could buy it at the store, it was provided to every student in the UK. So he did a bunch of pieces that were dots. We'll talk perhaps a little bit later on about art cars. And this was his version of the art car. The company BMW, they had bought the British company that makes the Mini. That's what this car is. And they had taken a bunch of artists and commissioned them to make art cars. So he took his little dots, which he didn't make himself, and put them all over his car. So he kind of extended some of these pieces. You can see this one with the Virgin Mother, a suggestive name, but similar to the kind of anatomy lesson toy that we had looked at earlier, again on a massive scale. So over time, he basically got to the point where he was selling just to the wealthiest people in the world. So very far away from what the original intention was with the young British artist. And this particular piece, For the Love of God, was sold for millions and millions of dollars at an auction. And it is exactly what it looks like. It's a human skull, and it's covered with platinum, diamonds. Those are all real diamonds and human teeth. Just making this was millions upon millions of dollars. And when it was sold at auction, it sold for not a huge profit, but a certain amount of profit. But what many people in the press thought is that the piece was actually bought by investors in Damien Hirst. And the reason why they bought it is because they wanted to raise the prices of his artwork. And there was some suggestive direct evidence for this. But one of the reasons why people thought that it was true afterwards is because he did in a huge kind of like one man auction and made hundreds of millions of dollars in one day, basically. So if the idea was this was bought by a group of investors in Damien Hirst, so basically Damien Hirst has been financialized, as they say in the economics profession, that if it could raise the prices, this would be worth it, even though you basically nothing was bought and sold at all. And that's indeed what happened. So he kept making some pieces like this. This one is a fetal skull. And he sold a bunch of pieces at this beautiful inside my head forever at Sotheby's. And this is a one-day auction with a bunch of pieces like this. And the total for the show was 111 million pounds. At that time, that was 198 million dollars. So he literally made 198 million dollars. Well, you would subtract some of the auction fees in one day. And in a way, and you can kind of see why this is called, I call this art as a hustle, or he's an artist hustler. And then the way that people call it commodity art. Because the type of people he would be selling to at this point, and this piece, which is called the Golden Calf, was sold for 18.3 million American dollars. The type of people he's selling to is the very, very wealthiest of art collectors. So some of the people that would be in the royal family and Qatar, um, some of the Russian oligarchs, these type of people, and they will often buy art and then it'll, disappear into their collection somewhere because they're partially buying the art because, wealthy people sometimes want to show off, but also as investment properties. So in my way of thinking, it's almost like he's trolling these collectors. He calls this the golden calf. And if you're not familiar, the golden calf is a story that's both in the Bible, the Christian Bible, in the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Bible, and also in the Quran. So Muslims also have the same story. And the story is that Moses went up to the mountain to get the Ten Commandments. And while he was gone, the people that were there lost their faith and they made a calf. In the translation of the Quran I read, they called it heifer, so a bigger cow. They made a cow out of gold and worshipped it. And the kind of lesson from this story is supposed to be that people, instead of worshiping God, they can worship things. So that's why I feel this is kind of a troll to his mega wealthy collectors who are worshiping, instead of like interesting ideas, the gods of these expensive artworks. So he kept making work, but again, most of the work that he's doing, I'm showing you at this point, he's not physically making it. He's basically a business complete with investors I had mentioned before, and they have employees that make these types of pieces. He puts his signature on it, as you can see right here, and then they sell it out there. I hadn't talked about Andy Warhol in enough detail to mention this, but he also did the same thing. He called his art studio, a factory, and they produced prints like this, and wasn't always him that was producing them. So he got kind of bored of this, I guess you could say, and had become so wealthy it didn't matter anymore. He's currently the world's wealthiest uh, visual artist, so about a billionaire or so. And he started making actual paintings, which he hadn't done much of since he was much younger. And he felt like his skills were kind of low, but he felt like he was driven to it. So you can see this one, Ghost Skull, and I'll post a video where he talks about some of these paintings, and you can get an idea of his personality and see what you think about him. So most of these pieces, they're just kind of like skulls that are floating in this kind of darker version of the dot pictures that he was doing before. So this one, again, this was an idea that he seems to steal from other artists. This is a butterfly collage, and it's very literal. These are actual butterflies that are collected, and it's quite beautiful, but also a little bit disturbing. They basically make the effect of a stained glass window, but these are real bugs. So he kind of looks at this, like I said, he's not necessarily making the art. He says, I curate my own work as if I were a group of artists. So kind of saying to justify all these different styles that he does, but also perhaps trying to justify the particular works of art that he seems to be stealing from other artists. So these pieces, they're pretty amazing, the way that they come out, but again, made out of living beings, like some of the pieces, well, once living beings, like some of the pieces we had seen before. So this is something to think about if you're looking for something to post on your extra credit board. You could think, is Damien Hirst's work art? Why or why not? So that's the end of this one. I hope you enjoyed it.